Hello, guys. Welcome to this new presentation. I'm your host, Don Corleone. And today we're going to be talking about blind versus blind exploits. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different presentation from potentially other videos or other information that you've learned about blind versus blind, because honestly, it's going to be pretty bare bones. It's going to be fairly foundational, and I don't want that to make you think that that's less important. In fact, I would say that this is one of the most important things, right? Like, you should first attack the low-hanging fruit, and once you have capitalized on the low-hanging fruit as much as possible, then you can move on to more complex concepts. But usually the more complex you go, the more diminishing returns you're getting, right? So the kind of stuff that we're going to talk about today is going to be fairly basic, but it's going to have a big impact on your win rate, especially if you're playing at low stakes, mid stakes against weaker opponents, definitely against recreationals, against weaker regulars, etc. So today we're going to learn about blind versus blind, and I'm going to oversell it to you a little bit. Bear with me. We're going to talk about how to win with no skill, right? And of course, that's not quite true. I don't really believe that you can win at poker with no skill whatsoever. But some of the things we're going to talk about are so basic, and they work in a way that doesn't really need so much execution, that you could almost say you don't need skill to beat a lot of weaker players. We're going to talk about setting your ranges up for success, and that's basically going to be the most of what we're going to talk about. How to set up our pre-flop ranges so that post-flop we don't really need to be geniuses. We just need to play with the correct range and then let it play itself, right? And then win. The things we're going to talk about are definitely very good for destroying weaker pools, right? As you move up, pre-flop leagues, flop leagues are going to be less and less common. I'm talking like maybe 1 KNL, 2 KNL, and even still, there's a decent amount of players at high stakes against whom you can apply some of these things. But if you're playing low stakes, mid stakes, or micro stakes, some of these things are going to apply to 95% of players or more. And we're going to talk about boosting your red line, right? Who doesn't like some red line here and there? I've always been a bit of a, or more of a blue liner than a red liner. So every time I find ways to improve my red line, that's usually how I improve my overall win rate the most as well. So why does this matter? In weaker pools and on higher rake environments, we need to create big edges from common mistakes. Okay, once again, this is not as impactful at high stakes where everyone has their pre-flop ranges very, very well studied and very well practiced and very well, executed. But even at 100 NL, 200 NL, some of these things are so widespread that you can gain huge amount of win rate from hammering on very, very simple leaks. And on the flip side, at the lower stakes you play, the more rake you're going to be paying. For instance, at 100 NL, 50 NL, you might be paying 7 to 10 big blinds per 100 in rake. Right? So just waiting for your opponent to make mistakes, right? Just sitting there and waiting for your opponent to make like a couple big blinds per 100 mistake, 5 big blinds per 100 mistake. That's just not going to cut it when you're paying 10 big blinds per 100 in rake, right? You need to crush your opponents. A lot of common mistakes happen pre-flop and on the flop. Okay, I'll reiterate this for the millionth time. Good players will fix these leaks eventually, right? But even at the highest stakes, there's still a decent amount of players who haven't fixed yet some of the most basic pre-flop and flop leagues, right? There's this fallacy that, oh, online poker is getting so tough, everyone is so balanced, everyone's just copying the solver, and the edges are non-existent, right? That's very, very false. In fact, if you look at the average 100 NL poker stars player, or just whatever quote unquote tough site that you would conceive as not a very soft one, if you look at the average stats of the average regular on those pools, you will see that they are misplaying pre-flop. They're just misplaying the most basic spots there are. If we set up a favorable scenario with our ranges, we don't need to outskill our opponents. Now, I'm not telling you don't outskill your opponents. I'm not telling you don't play smarter. I'm not telling you don't learn to play better. I'm just telling you, if you set up your range correctly, it's going to be tough to mess it up, basically, right? It's going to be hard to not win when you have the exploitatively correct range. So let's do this quiz. Who is winning more than GTO? Okay, we have two players, blind versus blind. Small blind opens queen three offsuit and other similar hands. So a small blind is opening basically queen three offsuit, jack five offsuit, king deuce offsuit, like offsuit gappers, hands of that nature. Every suited hand, just opening very, very wide. Let's say the 70 or 80% of the total hands, right? So very, very deviated from GTO. Big blind is following GTO wizard big blind defense charts, but the big blind is making a frequency mistake where they are folding pure with mixed folds, right? When a hand is either folding or calling, this big blind player is always folding that hand. And when a hand is either three betting or calling, this player is calling it always, right? Who is winning more than GTO? If this first player is making all this basically wild plays with wild hands, or is the big blind winning by making a more mild mistake? So let me launch this. So who is winning more than GTO? So the answer is the small blind. Okay. There's this another fallacy that's very common. I would say it comes from a good place, but it can be misused. It's this idea of fundamental mistake versus frequency mistake, which fundamentally it's a good idea. I like it, but it doesn't always apply when there's adjustments going on, right? Like a player making a fundamental mistake, like for example, opening queen three offsuit, which would be a play that the solver deems as a very big mistake, right? Probably losing like 10, 20 big blinds per 100. In this particular scenario, that deviation is beating the big blinds deviation, even though the big blinds deviation is a lot more mild. It's a lot more of just a frequency mistake, right? Which would be conceived, it would be easy to conceive it as not as severe, right? But in fact, in this case, the small blind is exploiting the big blind because the big blind is granting too much equity realization to the small blind, right? So let's talk a little bit about the fragility of equilibrium, okay? GTO is predicated upon extremely fine-tuned variables, meaning the solution that the solver is giving you in terms of sizings, frequencies, the particular hand selection, the blockers, all of those things, if you changed the inputs slightly, the output would be vastly different, right? So that kind of shows you that maybe trying to always play perfect GTO is not the best option. And in fact, if you misapply it, it can be a huge mistake. Like for example, in this big blind scenario where The big blind is kind of trying to follow the charts, but it's misapplying it by a little bit. And that's already causing a disaster scenario where it can get destroyed by a small blind, right? So very, very important to understand this. Small changes in frequencies, even if every hand is played reasonably well, lead to massive exploit opportunities. So I'm basically restating the same thing I just said, which is that even if you play every hand properly, quote unquote, properly, right? If your overall frequencies are not correct, your opponent can respond by adjusting. And if he adjusts very drastically, like in the previous scenario, he can actually exploit you. So the last paragraph there is in a scenario where player A is big blind and player B is small blind. Player A could be playing solver approved every hand, while player B is making fundamental errors, yet player B could be the one beating player A. Okay, so again, that's basically referencing the example that we just looked at. Frequencies matter a lot, especially when that data can be gathered, right? If you're playing anonymous poker, or if you're playing live poker, or you're playing in a scenario where your opponents are not able to either gather data on your frequencies nor guess, right? Because sometimes you could get exploited just by your opponent guessing. But if your opponent can't do either thing, then your frequencies don't matter as much, right? Also, if a node is very obscure, if it's a very niche scenario, then your frequencies there won't matter as much. But your pre-flop frequencies, especially on a site where people can gather data from HUDs, right? These are going to be very, very big potential mistakes, even if they are just frequency mistakes and not fundamental errors. Let's talk about pre-flop exploits as a small blind, right? And we already touched on one of them. When you RFI the small blind, the EV of your bottom of range comes from two places mainly: folds and equity realization. And I'm basically not talking about equity, which is of course a big factor for where your EV comes from, because that I take it as obvious that the equity of our hand is going to be very, very important when it comes to how much money we make with a certain hand. But these are some of the extra variables that affect that EV, which is how many folds we're getting either now or later, and how easy, how cheap is it going to be to see a flop, potentially to see a turn, to see a river, to see showdown, right? So folds and equity realization. Folds, your opponent fold frequency regulates the EV you gain from folds, right? Like that's the variable you need to look at for that portion of your EV is your opponent's folding frequency. And then your opponent's 3-betting frequency is going to regulate the EV you gain from equity realization. Basically, the less you get 3-bet, the more you're going to see a flop, right? Even if your opponent calls enough, just by him not 3-betting you, you're going to be able to yield higher EV. And big blind's post-flop style, even if reasonable, can shift your equity realization. Okay, so for example, if your opponent is slightly too sticky post-flop and slightly too aggressive, that could be deemed as a good player. But even though post-flop, it's quite difficult to exploit that player, pre-flop, we can set up our ranges for success, right? Basically, against a very sticky and aggressive player, our good hands are going to yield higher EV, and our bad hands are going to yield lower EV. Therefore, if we set up our range pre-flop to have less bad hands and more good hands, we're going to be exploiting our opponent post-flop without really doing anything too crazy or drastic, just by virtue of him playing the way he plays and us having a range that's stronger than what he expects. Let's take a quick look at the small blinds open range. Let's look at some of the EVs to kind of understand why certain exploits work, right? As we can see, the open frequency cumulatively with limps and raises, it's around 50%, 51.5%. But let's look at the borderline hands, right? Like, for example, a 10-4 suited. As we can see, the EV of opening there is 0.01. Even if we get to a hand like 10-5 suited or Jack-3 suited or maybe King-8 offsuit, all of those hands yield some EV, but it's not that much. And if we go the opposite direction, for instance, Queen-7 offsuit is losing 0.06. King-6 offsuit is actually 0 EV open. 8-4 suited is minus 0.03, right? So keep those sort of numbers in mind. That's losing like 1, 2, 3, 4 big blinds per 100 whenever you open those hands. Now, think about what it would be if your opponent just folds 5% more hands than equilibrium, right? If your opponent is just folding 5% more often than equilibrium, that's already granting you, right? Let's say he is folding these hands right here, and then this hands and this. That's probably already more than 5% overfold. And if you think about it, that's granting you 1.5 big blinds, 5% more of the time. So that's around like 0.07. So like 7 big blinds per 100. Right? You need to understand that a 5% shift in frequency is going to affect EV by a much higher, maybe not much higher degree, but definitely at a very severe degree that equilibrium is too fragile to take into account, basically. Yes, 1-1, you have a question about how to calculate pre-flop EV. But to continue with what I was saying is that these hands, it doesn't take your opponent to do something way too crazy for you to start opening this borderline hands. And on the flip side, it doesn't take your opponent to be way too aggressive for you to not want to open some of these hands, right? Now, I don't want you to use this excuse to follow your pre-established biases. I'm just giving you some food for thought, where if you have data from your opponents, if you can look at a HUD, if you can look at population data of your stakes, your site, some of these ranges should be tailored if you want to gain maximum EV from your opponents. So let's talk about the first example that we're going to look at, which is the passive reg. Okay, and the reason why I choose it as the first example because at 50 NL, 25 NL, 100 NL, it's going to be like pretty much 90% of players. The vast majority of players are going to be making this sort of mistake, which is basically folding mixed hands, right? And not 3-betting enough with the mixed hands that should be 3-bet around here and around here, right? This is HRC, and here we've solved for an opponent that is defending a range such as this, which we just looked at, right? It's not that dissimilar from GTO. It's 3-betting 13% of the time instead of 16, 17%, and it's calling 37%. So it's folding around 5-6% more than GTO. Basically, the example we were talking about. The response that the small blind is coming up with to exploit this player is this, which resembles of the quiz that we launched at the beginning of the presentation, where the small blind is choosing to open queen 3 offsuit, jack 5 offsuit, king deuce offsuit, suited gappers, etc. Right? And you just need to realize, by the way, the reason it's limping, you shouldn't get too boggled down with the fact that it's only opening and almost never limping. Basically, that's one of those things that is very fragile about equilibrium. And it comes down to the exact response that we forced on the big blind versus a raise and versus a limp, right? If we made our opponent maybe ISO versus a limp a couple percent less, and then we made him 3-bet 1% more versus a raise, it could change it completely, potentially up to maybe limping 90% of the opening range, right? So I wouldn't get too boggled down with that. I would mostly take away from this the width of the range, okay? You should play very wide ranges versus these passive opponents. And this simulation is not even taking into account the fact that our opponent that is passive pre-flop and overfolding pre-flop tends to be the same kind of opponent that is going to be passive post-flop and that is going to overfold to c-bets, etc. Okay? Even though it would seem intuitive to say, for example, that our opponent is defending a tighter range, therefore post-flop he's going to be playing stronger, more aggressive, folding less, etc. That, for the most part, doesn't hold in practice. Most people who are passive pre-flop, they just apply the same philosophy and they keep folding mixed hands post-flop. They keep folding hands that are closed. They don't bluff enough with air, etc. Right? So, if anything, this simulation is underestimating how much we can push the needle here in terms of width of our range. So 1-1 asks, facing a passive reg, we should never limp in the small blind and play very wide ranges. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about limps. Right now, I don't really care so much whether the solver is deciding to limp or to RFI. I'm mostly trying to look at the width of the range. Okay. Let's talk about another example, which is, let me open it up, the over-aggressive regular. Okay, this is a reg that is kind of following something resembling of the charts, but he's overdoing the 3-bets with bluffs, and he is calling a little bit too much with these hands. Actually, at higher stakes, where the reg is lower, these hands are okay to defend, but at mid stakes and definitely low stakes, these should be just folded in equilibrium for those stakes, right? But these players actually tend to be fairly good. They have figured out that overfolding and under 3-betting doesn't really work very well, especially in sites where there's HUDs, but maybe they've pushed too much towards the other side, and we can still take advantage of that. We have this player right here defending this range that we just looked at, and our exploit as a small blind should be to open very tight. Now, once again, the solver here is deciding to limp a lot. I don't want you to get too boggled down with the fact that it's limping a lot. Why? Because what's happening is that when we're limping, we've set up the node lock to ISO or to raise 55% of the time. And when we raise, we're getting 3-bet 23% of the time. Now, this is very, very fragile. If we maybe make it so that we get 3-bet 21% of the time and that we get raised when we limp 57% of the time, the output could change completely to like never limping, for example, or barely limping. Okay? Now, I don't know that for sure. I'm just saying that this is not the point of what I'm trying to test in this simulation. What I'm trying to test for sure is what we talked about in terms of these hands just not cutting it for an open, right? This king offsuit, 10-5 suited, these hands that were close in theory, they just don't cut it anymore, right? And in fact, we went from a 52% open to around a 30 something percent, 38 open. If you force big blind to ISO a lot, it will limp a tight range that extracts a lot of money from that ISO range. Yes, exactly. And then we're going to talk about some of those scenarios right now where our opponent is defending. So the kind of profiles that we're modeling right now are just overall aggressive everywhere or just overall passive everywhere. But later we're going to talk about players who have one aggressive tendency on one line, but maybe a passive tendency on a different line, or a normal tendency on a different line. So yeah, again, if you're playing an aggressive opponent that is 3-betting too much, ISOing too much, calling you too much, and then once again, we're not taking into account how post-flop is played by this player. If this is the kind of guy that's not going to be folding too much to c-bets, he's going to be stabbing a lot, he's going to raise your 3-bet, your c-bet a lot, then our EV in terms of opening pre-flop is already going to go even lower than what this sim is showing. Can you show the ISO range? Yes. So this is the ISO range. We've made the in-position player, the big blind here, ISO very, very wide. GTO would be around 37, 38, 39%. And this guy is going 55% of the time, mainly just adding a bunch of pure hands to the bluff range. What's ISO? I mean, ISO is not a great name for this particular spot, because when we say ISO, we usually mean isolating ourselves against the limper, right? And in this case, you're already isolated because it's blind versus blind, but it's basically raising against the limper. So now we're going to talk about this example. And this, I also want to talk about a more general concept based on this example, which is basically players that are going to cause us to make very, very severe splits in our range. Players that are going to incentivize us to split all of our strong hands into one line and all of our weak hands into another line. And this is why I call this best case scenarios. Now we're going to look at one particular case of this scenario, but this kind of applies in even the opposite way and in many different ways. We're going to talk about it. So we have a guy that's defending the same versus a open versus a raise, right? His defense is the same as the previous player, but now his ISO is not as severe. He's just ISOing a more normal range. And that's already causing a best case scenario for us, because it means that if we want to avoid aggression, we can put our hands in the limp line. And if we want to incentivize aggression, we can open raise our hands, right? This causes a very, very big exploit that we can do, which is we can open raise. We can open raise with a strong range, right? You can see this frequency is similar to GTO open frequency, but the difference is that instead of mixing kind of every hand everywhere, the way GTO does it, we're splitting in a very, very face-up way, where our opens are very strong and our limps are very, very weak. Now, why are we doing that? Because our opponent is responding kind of reasonable when we limp. He's actually over raising a little bit, but only by a little bit. Therefore, we can limp our weaker parts of our range, and then we can RFI the stronger parts of our range. Now, the solver is still mixing, right? The solver is still mixing because node locks, basically the solver in a node lock sim is still going to readjust on post-flop nodes, right? If, for example, we only open with strong hands and we only limped with weak hands in this simulation, the solver would the big blind would get to post-flop and then understand that range interaction and massively exploit us later, right? Therefore, we're finding that the correct way to avoid that is by mixing some of these hands. I would argue that this is not really important in real life, right? If an opponent is raising versus our limps, not a crazy amount, but he is 3-betting us a lot when we open, then what I would do is I would just open linearly with a very strong range, maybe like a cutoff open, and then I would limp the rest. Okay? Now, this is one example of a best case scenario. There's even better scenarios, and there's also the opposite scenario. Now, I haven't run it, but if you can imagine this scenario, now imagine the opposite, where our opponent maybe doesn't 3-bet us enough when we open raise, but then when we limp, he raises very, very, very aggressively, right? In that case, basically this range would flip over backwards, right? If our opponent is 3-betting a lot when 3-betting not enough when we open, but he's ISOing very, very aggressively when we limp, the way we should play against that player is limp a strong range, right? And then just open a weak range, right? So that's why those are the best cases for our EV, is because we can both play a very wide range and still gain a lot of EV with our good hands, because that's usually a trade-off versus most players that are overall aggressive or overall passive. We're trading off either playing a wider range but making less money when we have a good hand against, for example, a passive player, and against an aggressive player we would be trading off playing a tighter range but making more money when we have a good hand, right? But if the player has two different tendencies on two different lines, we can both play a wide range and put our strong hands in the line that makes the most money. Okay, so these guys are the most profitable for us. If, of course, it's very difficult to gather these reads, right? But once we've gathered these reads, these exploits are very, very, very profitable. So let's talk about our conclusions. We can exploit our opponent by expanding or narrowing our small blind range, depending on the amount of folds and 3-bets we face. Okay. To recall the GTO numbers, we should roughly get around 40 to 45% folds, and we should roughly get 3-bet from 16 or 15% to 18% within that range, right? So anyone outside those numbers, we could exploit by doing some of these things. The best case scenario happens when our opponent is very aggressive on one line and very passive on another. We can generate extra EV with strong hands and with weak hands. Let's talk about post-flop considerations. And I've already touched on it a couple of times, but equity realization can be massively affected by how our opponent plays. Both his aggression and his folds post-flop affect our EV. Okay, let me give you a very simple example. Let's say the small blind is range betting the flop on 80% of flops, right? And then if we go on pile solver or a post flop solver, and we solve the exploit against that guy that's range betting, we find that it's not that bad. Like that guy range betting, it's not really making a mistake. Like he can do that. He's not really losing EV. Now, even if that's true, even if his strategy is reasonable, his post-flop aggression is still higher than what we would face in equilibrium. Therefore, pre-flop, even if his post-flop strategy is reasonable, we can start folding some hands from the big blind in order for him to now be making a more severe mistake post-flop when he range bets, right? The reason why range bet is a good simplification is it's a good simplification only within the constraints of the pre-flop ranges that we've already established. Now, if I defend tighter pre-flop, your range bet now becomes a lot worse. Now you're making a more severe mistake. And let's think about some of the post-flop leaks that we might face when we open the small blind, right? I'll go back to them and I'll talk more about post-flop exploits later, but let's just get a quick look at some of the things that might happen. Let's just think about this flop, Jack 9-5, pretty common or pretty just like average flop. The way most people are going to tend to make mistakes is by extrapolating button versus big blind into blind versus blind, where it doesn't really apply, right? Button versus big blind, maybe you should fold like 40% for small bet here, or like 35%. Whereas blind versus blind, you should fold 25%. You should find a lot weaker calls. The Queen 7 of diamonds, right? King 6 of diamonds. So common leaks that we will find when we open the small blind is players over folding to the c-bet, maybe not raising enough, although that's more across the board. That's not particular to blind versus blind. And let's look at the reports as well. So we see that the overall fold to c-bet versus small bet across every board, it should be 25%. Okay, I will tell you right now, this is not really what's happening at low stakes or even mid stakes. Okay, players are folding even in the weaker pools, even closer to 40% than 25%, right? Exactly, it's very close to MDF. And the reason is because even though you have a range advantage as the out of position player, you are out of position, and that's being out of position is an inherent disadvantage. So that already kind of points in the direction that opening wider, not just because our opponents are potentially misplaying pre-flop, like not calling with enough mixed hands, not three betting with enough mixed hands, but if they're later on post-flop falling too much to the c-bet, falling too much to the delay c-bet, falling too much to the check bet, all of those things are generally true for weaker pools, then we can open even wider. Okay? And this is why some players even advocate opening every hand in the small blind in very, very weak populations. Right? Let's talk about pre-flop exploits as the big blind. Similarly to the previous scenario, we need to establish the fold frequency we're getting and our equity realization, which comes in this case from 4-bets, right? The main variables that we're going to look at is the fold to 3-bet and the 4-bet. Additional considerations are post-flop leaks and play style. Okay, so very, very similar. We're the big blind now. As we can see, our folds should be around 42.7%, 16% 3-bet. But let's look at the EV though. Let's look at these mixed hands specifically, like Jack 9 offsuit. You can see that the EV of 3-betting and the EV of calling is exactly the same. That makes sense because the hand is mixed. The hand is sometimes 3-betting, sometimes calling. If one EV was higher than the other, then you would just do that, right? But because the EV is the same, we can use this hand to balance our frequencies. Now, imagine our opponent is just folding slightly more to a 3-bet. He's just folding 5% too much to a 3-bet. What do you think is going to happen to the EVs? Of course, the call EV is going to stay the same, right? Our opponent over folding to 3-bets is not going to change our call EV. So let's say it's just going to stay as 0.28. But if it's overfolding 3-bets, the raise EV is going to be higher. It's going to be like, I don't know, like 0.1 higher, whatever it is, right? So that kind of points towards the previous idea we established, that equilibrium is very, very fragile. And if our opponent is overfolding to 3-bets, even if not by that much, a bunch of these mixed hands start becoming very, very profitable 3-bets, right? So it's not, I haven't run this, but hopefully by now, by looking at the examples that I've shown you, you can trust this actually is how it works. If our opponent is, for example, not 4-betting enough or not calling enough, we can go up to maybe 30 or 40% 3-betting from the big blind. Okay. So let's look at his falling frequency, 60%. So I would say that usually in weaker pools, the folds are not really going to be that bad, blind versus blind on average, but the 4-bets are usually going to be pretty bad. Right? This is cumulatively 3-betting or 4-betting 21% of the time, right? You will find in a lot of weaker pools that you get 4-bet on average, maybe 12, 13, 14% of the time, right? So once again, a very common leak, a very common exploit that we can apply versus more passive regs is going to be to 3-bet a lot, right? On the flip side, if this player was a maniac, if we saw him just 4-betting us constantly, never falling to a 3-bet, then sure, he would just 3-bet less. But usually, most common exploits tend towards over-aggression on your part to exploit the passivity of your opponents, right? We can also talk about our calling range, okay? This is what the solver is finding to be the threshold for calls. But once again, this is very fragile. And we've already talked about how post-flop playstyle, for example, if the player just range bets every board, right? That's not a huge mistake on his part, but it's something that we can exploit before it happens, right? So if a player was range betting every flop, we would just fold a few of these hands, few extra folds, right? If our opponent is check folding too much on the flop, then we can call more hands, right? This basically goes back to the idea that our opponent's post-flop playstyle is going to affect our equity realization, which we can define as how cheap it is to see additional cards, to see the flop, to see the turn, to see the river, to see showdown. And if the player is passive, it's also going to affect our EV by granting us additional folds later on. Let's look at the reports here, because this is an interesting spot that I want to talk about, where players on average might be able to check around this frequency, even potentially not enough. This is the c-bet node, right? Small blind opens, and they get to the flop and they decide whether to c-bet or not. Across boards, they should be c-betting around 42% of the time, 43% of the time, and they should be checking 57, 58% of the time, right? This might be close to how people are playing, but what happens though is that where people are really misplaying is when they check and then you bet, right? See that the average fold on this node should be 36% versus a half pot, right? I would say that in weaker pools, this tends to be much, much higher. And some players are going to have folds here in the 50s, in the 60s. It can go insane, right? So taking those things into account, if we, once again, expect to get additional equity realization post-flop and additional folds, we can defend wider, right? This goes back to the idea that if we set up our pre-flop ranges correctly, in terms of exploits, it's really, really difficult for our opponent to come back from that with flashy outplays and GTO cookie stuff, right? La Bestiole asks, would it be a good idea to simplify our life and 3-bet the same frequency, but with an easier range to remember? Like, for example, ace-deuce offsuit to ace-5 offsuit in the 3-bet range instead of these king-6 offsuit sometimes, queen-6 offsuit sometimes. We would still deny equity realization, have our frequencies right, and I doubt they can easily see it and adapt. I tend to agree with that. I don't think there would be really any issue. The potential issue that could happen, but this is kind of like science fiction or like really, really far-fetched, is if you get to such a high level that players are really, really diving into your strategy, it could become a problem at some point. But we're talking like battling high stakes, right? But besides that, I really don't think there would be any issue with that. Right? I remember I saw somewhere, I don't remember where I saw it, but I saw somewhere that when Red Baron was battling, other players discovered that his slow play limp in the small blind was always queens, right? He was limping the small blind a lot with aces, ace, king, kings, right? He was just limping queens. So he was basically kind of doing what you're saying. He was trying to have a proper frequency, but choosing certain specific hands to do the job, right? Now, that works perfectly fine until people really, really dive deep into your game, like they did with Red Baron, right? But for most people, by far, just playing hands pure, if your frequencies look correct, is not an issue. Now, my counter to that is it's not that difficult to just draw off table, just draw a range on like Flopzilla or somewhere where you RNG like 50-50 with some hands. Like it's not that difficult to do that and then remember it. And there's not really a downside to doing that versus doing what you're saying, which would be off tables, selecting a pure 3-bet or pure call range. But again, I think it's okay. It doesn't really matter that much. So conclusions, if our opponent under 4-bets or over folds, we can 3-bet significantly more, okay? Significantly more. A more passive defense will lead to a more linear range, while a more aggressive one will lead to a polar range. We haven't talked about this, so let me explain it. If our opponent is falling to 3-bet a lot, right? But then he's 4-betting a lot, right? We should 3-bet them very, very polar, because our nutted hands would, of course, just gain EV from getting 4-bet. And then we want to 3-bet with hands that don't really mind getting blown off the pot, because we're going to get 4-bet very often, right? Whereas if our opponent has a more passive defense, where, for example, he's not 4-bet, let's, for example, say he's not 4-betting enough, but he's just calling a lot. He's not folding much, right? That would cause us to shift, not necessarily change our frequencies much, but shift our range into a more linear one. Because now we're not so scared to get blown off the pot while raising with like a mediocre kind of decent hand. And now we need hands that can play post-flop, right? In the previous scenario, we didn't need to build our range around post-flop playability because we wouldn't get to post-flop that often. In a scenario where our opponent calls a lot, we're going to get to post-flop more. Therefore, our range should be at least a little bit more linear because, you know, we're going to get to post-flop more often. And once again, think about post-flop equity realization. Against some players, you should just play tighter. And that doesn't mean you, like, some people frame this as you're trying to avoid a better player, right? Like, oh, this guy is good, I'm just going to fold because I don't want to play against a good player. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is we are expecting a certain player to be too sticky, which decreases the EV of our weak hands. Therefore, we want to be tighter pre-flop and capitalize on our strong hands gain EV from that player. Common post-flop leaks, blind versus blind. Humans learn by extrapolation, and extrapolation is bad in extreme scenarios. Okay, this is what we've talked about in terms of how people study bottom versus big blind single raise spots usually, and then they try to extrapolate that knowledge to other scenarios, right? A blind versus blind is a spot where the defender is in position, so it's way different. The defender has a wider range, so it's way different. So it's not a spot where you can extrapolate a lot. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. Blind versus blind single raise spot has extremely wide ranges. Okay. And if you're going to take away something about this section, is what I'm about to say right now, is that most common human leaks will, blind versus blind, will have to do with underestimating the width of the defense threshold. Right? Once again, people are extrapolating from spots where ranges are tighter and the defender is out of position. Now the defender is in position, so he needs to defend wider, and his range is wider, so he needs to defend wider, right? So a lot of leaks will come down to people overfolding to the C-bet, overfolding to the delay C-bet, just overfolding across the board. Common leaks on the small blind will have to do with extrapolating in position strategies to out of position, right? Once again, if you extrapolate from a scenario where you're button versus big blind, the button is in position. If you build your range the same way in the small blind, it's going to be very, very bad. It's going to be a garbage range because out of position, you need to do a lot more slow playing, right? If you have a checking range, let's say on a certain board, you have a 40% checking range. If you're in position, you can kind of just bet with the good hands. But out of position, you need to have a decent amount of checks with even the strongest hands, right? So a common leak that will happen for weaker players out of position on the small blind is going to be checking too weak of a range, for example, not check raising enough, check folding too much because their range is not properly constructed. Their betting range being too linear. That's kind of the idea. So to summarize, equilibrium is very fragile. Pay attention to defense frequency and re-raise frequency. Okay, this is across the board. We've talked about blind versus blind, but you could apply this to everywhere, right? If you have a lot of data on your opponents, either by doing MDA or from the HUDs by gathering a lot of very large samples on them, you can use this to look at how much they fold to a C-bet, how much they check raise, how much they 3-bet you, and how much they fold, which is what we were talking about. But again, you can apply this to every position, to the flop, etc. Expand or contract your ranges depending on equity realization, right? Meaning how easy it is to see cards and see showdown, and also to some extent how many folds you're getting right away. And take post-flop tendencies into account. This will affect our equity realization. Post-flop, common leaks will be overfolding and poor range construction out of position. Thanks for watching. And yeah, I hope you find it helpful. I hope it helps you to move up from those rake traps that are low stakes. And yeah, see you guys in the next one.